He had been declared a living corpse for 3 long years. Machines breathed for him, silence spoke for him. And everyone in Doctor's family, even his own father, had already said their goodbyes. But on this night, in a dim hospital room after midnight, a low-paid maid knelt beside his bed and did something that could cost her everything. Her hands were shaking. Her voice broke as she whispered his name. Then the heart monitor spiked. Nurses would later swear it was impossible. Doctors would call it a mistake. But in that suspended moment between life and death, something awakened. And nothing would ever be the same again. Before we begin the full story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you believe kindness can change destiny, subscribe to this channel because this story will stay with you. 3 years earlier, Robert Adebayo had been the kind of young man people didn't know how to place. He dressed simply, plain shirts, clean sneakers, no flashy watches, yet the chauffeur who dropped him off always drove a black SUV worth more than most houses on the street. He walked through crowds like he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. And when strangers spoke to him, he listened like their words mattered. Most people only knew one thing for sure: Robert was the only son of Elijah Adebayo. And in their city where wealth spoke louder than sirens, Elijah Adebayo's name didn't just open doors, it removed them. Elijah was a millionaire who built his empire with 2 hands and a heart that had learned to harden early. Real estate, logistics, warehouses that stretched across the outskirts like concrete kingdoms, trucks that moved day and night carrying goods across highways where armed checkpoints and potholes fought for space. He had survived too much to believe in luck. So when Robert at 29 chose to stay humble, Elijah didn't fully understand it. People will take advantage of you. Elijah warned him one morning, standing by the window of his office tower watching the city wake up beneath them. This world respects power, not softness. Robert, seated calmly across from his father, smiled in a way that wasn't arrogant. Just steady. Softness isn't weakness, Dad, he said. It's control. Elijah scoffed, but there was something in his eyes. Something like pride trying not to show itself. Robert had grown up in luxury, yes, but he wasn't blind to the streets. He had seen the women selling fruit under the hot sun, babies tied to their backs. He had seen young boys washing windscreens at traffic lights, dodging cars like their lives didn't matter. He had seen men old enough to be his father sleeping under unfinished buildings. And Robert, he noticed. On some evenings after leaving work, he would ask the driver to pull over and hand out food quietly without cameras. He paid school fees for a cleaner's daughter after overhearing her cry about being sent home for owing. He once stood up at a company dinner and embarrassed a manager who had humiliated a waiter. Elijah heard about those things later, always from someone else, always spoken with that tone rich people used when they were secretly uncomfortable with kindness. Your son is different, they would say. And Elijah would respond with a tight smile, as if different was both a compliment and a warning. At home, Margaret Adebayo tried to keep the family soft where Elijah kept it sharp. Margaret was the quiet heartbeat of the mansion. She spoke gently, prayed often, and loved her son with a devotion so deep it could have been a religion. She had watched Robert become a good man, and it made her feel like she had done at least one thing right in this life. Elijah, she would tell her husband at night, lying beside him in their massive bed. Our son has a good spirit. Don't crush it. Elijah would grunt half asleep, his mind already counting profits and problems. I'm not crushing anything, he'd mutter. I'm preparing him. But even he couldn't deny it. Robert was the best thing in that house. And then one afternoon, everything broke. It was the kind of day that didn't feel like tragedy. The sky was bright. The air was thick with heat. Traffic was moving in angry waves, horns screaming like a language of frustration. Robert had left the office early, refusing the convoy his father sometimes assigned him. I'll be fine, Robert had told his driver, waving him off. I'm just heading to see someone. No one knew who that someone was. That small mystery would haunt the family later. By early evening, Elijah was still at work when his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. He almost ignored it. Then he answered, and the voice on the other end didn't speak like a person calling to greet someone. It spoke like fear. Sir, is this Mr. Elijah Adebayo? Elijah's chest tightened. Yes, who is this? There has been an accident. It's your son. Please come to St. Bridget Private Hospital. Elijah didn't remember standing up. He didn't remember grabbing his keys. He only remembered Margaret's face when he burst into the house, his voice too loud, too raw. "Robert has been in an accident." Margaret froze as if her body couldn't understand the words. "Accident," she whispered. "What do you mean, accident?" Elijah didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was he didn't know anything yet except that his heart had started running ahead of his mind. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and screaming tires. Elijah sat stiff in the back seat, staring forward like he could force the road to move faster. Margaret prayed nonstop, her hands clenched, her lips trembling. "God, please, please," she murmured. "Not my son, not my only son." At the hospital entrance, everything smelled like antiseptic and panic. Nurses ran past. A security man tried to stop them until someone recognized Elijah. "Let them pass," a voice shouted. They were led into a corridor where time felt slower, like the building itself knew what was waiting at the end. Then they saw him. Robert lay on a hospital bed surrounded by machines, tubes, wires, a mask over his face. His skin, usually warm alive, looked too still, too pale under the fluorescent lights. Margaret's knees almost gave out. "My baby," she cried, rushing forward, grabbing his hand like she could hold him back in the world. Elijah stood frozen at the foot of the bed, staring at his son's motionless chest rising and falling, only because a machine told it to. A doctor approached, tall, composed, but with eyes that had delivered too many bad news speeches. "Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo," he said, voice carefully controlled. "I am Dr. Kwame Mensah." Elijah forced words out. "Is he alive?" Dr. Mensah nodded once. "He is alive, but he suffered severe head trauma. There was bleeding in the brain. We've stabilized him." Margaret clutched Robert's hand tighter. "So, he will wake up." Dr. Mensah hesitated. That hesitation was a knife. "We don't know," he said quietly. "He is in a coma." Elijah stepped forward, rage flickering under shock. "What do you mean you don't know? You're a doctor. Do something. We have done what we can." Dr. Mensah replied, still calm but firm. "The next hours are critical." Margaret's voice cracked. "How did this happen? Who did this to him?" A nurse glanced away, uncomfortable. Dr. Mensah answered carefully. "There was a collision on the expressway. Witnesses say another vehicle swerved unexpectedly. Your son's car hit the barrier. It was a hard impact." Elijah's jaw tightened until it hurt. "Where is the other driver?" he demanded. "We're still gathering information," Dr. Mensah said. Elijah turned sharply, already planning. Calls, police, investigations, money, pressure. He knew how to move mountains when he wanted to, but none of that mattered in that moment because Robert did not open his eyes. Not that night, not the next day, not the next week. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and the hospital room became a strange altar where hope was offered every morning and swallowed by silence every night. At first, Elijah brought the best specialists. He flew in consultants. He demanded new scans. He paid for treatments that were whispered about like miracles. Every time Dr. Mensah sat with him, Elijah asked the same question. When will he wake up? And Dr. Mensah, honest, even when it hurt, could only say, "We're monitoring. We're hoping." Hoping. That word started to feel like an insult to a man who believed in certainty. After the first year, the city's sympathy began to fade. People stopped calling. Friends stopped visiting. Even business associates who once smiled too brightly around Elijah began to avoid conversations about Robert. And inside the mansion, the air changed. Margaret remained loyal to hope like it was oxygen. She kept Robert's room clean. She spoke to him as if he could hear. "Your father is working too hard," she would say softly, brushing the sheets as if smoothing his hair. "He thinks being strong means being cold. But I know you, Robert. You have always been the bridge between us." Elijah, on the other hand, grew quieter. Not softer, quieter. He stopped mentioning Robert's name at meetings, stopped discussing the hospital bills like they bothered him, though they didn't. He could pay them 10 times over. It wasn't the money that hurt him, it was the helplessness. The fact that for the first time in his life, Elijah Adebayo could not buy control. Late one night after year 2, Elijah stood alone in Robert's dark bedroom, staring at the framed graduation photo on the wall. Robert's smile in that photo was bright, almost innocent. Elijah whispered into the emptiness voice, "Ruff, why did you leave me with this?" It wasn't a question anyone could answer. By year 3, the doctors started using words they never said out loud in the beginning. Permanent, vegetative, unlikely. Dr. Mensa's tone grew heavier each time, like he was carrying both truth and guilt. "Elijah," he said one afternoon, "your son's body is stable, but the brain has not shown the signs we hoped for." Elijah stared at him, eyes sharp. "So what are you saying?" Dr. Mensa sighed. "I'm saying this may be the reality." Margaret, sitting beside the bed, shook her head violently. "No?" she whispered. "No, don't say that. Don't say that." Elijah's face stayed hard, but something in his chest cracked anyway. And while the Adebayo family sat trapped between faith and exhaustion, far away in a poorer part of the city, a young woman named Hannah Boateng was about to walk toward the mansion gates carrying nothing but her need to survive. She didn't know who Robert Adebayo was. She didn't know the family's grief. She didn't know her hands would soon be placed on the edge of a miracle or a disaster. All she knew was that her life was falling apart. And the Adebayo house, with all its wealth and cold silence, was about to become the place where destiny tested everyone. By the time the 3rd year arrived, the Adebayo mansion no longer felt like a home. It was still enormous, still polished, still guarded by tall gates and quiet men in uniforms. But something essential had drained from it, like blood slowly leaking from a wound no one could close. The silence was the worst part. In the early days after Robert's accident, the house had been loud with activity. Doctors came and went. Relatives filled the living room with prayers and hushed conversations. Elijah's phone never stopped ringing. Margaret slept on couches and chairs, refusing to rest properly, afraid she might miss a miracle. But time has a cruel way of thinning crowds. By the 3rd year, visitors were rare. Prayers had shortened. Conversations avoided Robert's name as if saying it out loud would summon disappointment. Every morning, Margaret still woke up early. She wrapped her scarf around her head and knelt by her bedside, whispering prayers into the quiet room. "God," she said, "every day, voice gentle but firm. If you can hear me, don't let my son be forgotten." Then she would dress carefully and head to the hospital. She never missed a day. At St. Bridget Private Hospital, the nurses knew her well. Some smiled kindly, others pitied her. A few avoided eye contact, unsure what to say to a woman who refused to let go. Margaret would sit by Robert's bed, hold his hand, and talk to him. She talked about everything, about the weather, about the flowers in the garden back home, about Elijah's temper and how he pretended not to care but still asked for updates every night. "Your father doesn't cry," she whispered once, brushing Robert's fingers. "But he breaks in other ways." Sometimes she read scripture, sometimes she told stories from Robert's childhood, how he used to hide under the dining table during storms, how he once gave away his favorite shoes to a boy who had none. "You were always like that," she said softly, "always giving pieces of yourself." The machines answered with steady beeps. Elijah visited too, but not like Margaret. At first he had come every day, then every other day, then once a week. His visits became shorter, more controlled, like business meetings he couldn't avoid. He stood at the foot of the bed, hands behind his back, eyes scanning monitors as if they were financial reports. "How is he?" he would ask. The same Dr. Kwame Mensah replied every time. Elijah nodded, jaw tight. "Call me if anything changes." Then he would leave. He told himself he was being strong, that someone had to keep life moving, that his company, his employees, his responsibilities didn't pause for grief. But the truth was harder. Standing beside Robert's bed made him feel useless. Elijah Adebayo had built his life on control. He controlled deals, outcomes, people. Even disasters bent eventually when enough money and force were applied. But Robert lay there untouched by any of it. No amount of wealth could bargain with silence. So Elijah withdrew, not because he didn't care, but because caring hurt too much. At home, he spent more time in his study. The walls were lined with awards and photographs from past achievements. He worked late into the night, signing papers he barely read, snapping at assistants who made small mistakes. Victor Danjuma, his trusted aide, noticed the change immediately. "You should rest," Sir Victor said one evening, standing respectfully by the desk. "You've been here since morning." Elijah didn't look up. "Rest doesn't wake my son." Victor hesitated, then spoke carefully. "The doctors have said this may be long-term." Elijah's pen froze mid-signature. "Be careful with your words," he said quietly. Victor nodded. "Of course, sir. I only meant you have done everything possible." Elijah finally looked up, his eyes sharp and tired. Doing everything possible doesn't mean accepting everything. Victor lowered his gaze. Understood. What Victor did not say, and what Elijah did not want to hear, was that the world was already moving on. At business dinners, people avoided the topic. At board meetings, Robert's name had disappeared from conversations entirely. He was no longer Elijah's son. He was that unfortunate situation, and that hurt Elijah more than he admitted. Margaret felt the distance growing between her and her husband. At night, when Elijah came to bed, his body felt present, but his spirit was elsewhere. She tried to reach him. "You should come with me tomorrow," she said one night, her voice hopeful. "Robert likes it when we're both there." Elijah sighed. "Margaret, he doesn't know who's there." She turned toward him sharply. "Don't say that. I'm being realistic." "No," she said, eyes filling. "You're protecting yourself." Elijah sat up, frustration flaring. "And what are you doing? Living in denial." Margaret's voice shook, but she didn't back down. "I'm holding on. There's a difference." They stared at each other in the darkness. Two people who loved the same son but were grieving in opposite directions. The argument ended the way most of theirs did now. In silence. The mansion staff noticed everything. They moved quietly, spoke softly, avoided eye contact. Some whispered among themselves, wondering how long the family would keep paying hospital bills for a man who might never wake. Others feared being dismissed if finances shifted. One older cleaner murmured to another one afternoon, "Rich people suffer too. They just suffer in bigger houses." Outside the walls of the mansion, life went on unaware and different. And in a cramped rented room across the city, Hannah Boateng's life was collapsing in its own quiet way. Hannah had grown up knowing struggle like a second language. Her father had died when she was young. Her mother sold cooked food by the roadside until sickness took her strength. Hannah left school early to work cleaning houses, washing clothes, doing whatever kept food on the table. When her mother finally passed, Hannah was 24 and completely alone. No inheritance, no connections, just debt and grief. She moved from job to job, always temporary, always replaceable. The last place she worked had promised stability. Instead, they cut her pay, delayed her wages, and finally told her not to return. "Business is slow," the woman said, not meeting Hannah's eyes. "We don't need you anymore." That night, Hannah sat on her mattress staring at the wall. No savings, no food left, rent overdue. She cried quietly, not loudly enough to disturb the neighbors, but deeply enough to hurt. The next morning, she tied her scarf, straightened her dress, and stepped back into the heat of the city to look for work again. House after house rejected her. "We're not hiring. Come back next month. Do you have references?" By late afternoon, her feet ached and her hope thinned. Then she stood in front of the Adebayo estate. The gate was tall. The walls were clean and intimidating. Guards stood at attention. Hannah almost turned away, but hunger pushed her forward. She approached the gate carefully, her voice respectful. "Good afternoon, sir," she said to the guard. "Please, I'm looking for work, anything at all." The guard looked her over, her worn shoes, her tired eyes. "We don't take walk-ins," he said flatly. Hannah swallowed. "I can clean, I can cook, I can learn." Another guard glanced toward the house. "Wait." Minutes passed. Sweat trickled down Hannah's back. She almost gave up again. Then a house supervisor arrived, a woman with a clipboard and a bored expression. "What's this?" she asked. "She's looking for work," the guard replied. The supervisor sighed. "We don't need—" She paused, thinking. Actually, there was one position no one wanted. She looked back at Hannah. "Can you handle difficult work?" Hannah nodded immediately. "Yes, Ma." The supervisor lowered her voice. "There is a patient, long-term, in a coma. It's not easy." Hannah hesitated only a second. "I can do it." The supervisor studied her, then shrugged. "Fine, you start tomorrow." Hannah thanked her repeatedly, relief flooding her chest. She didn't know whose life she was about to step into. She didn't know the weight of grief she was about to touch. She didn't know that inside a silent hospital room, a man named Robert Adebayo was waiting without knowing it for the one person who would refuse to give up on him. Hannah Boateng did not sleep that night. She lay on her thin mattress staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and generators humming through the darkness. Tomorrow echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. Tomorrow meant work. Tomorrow meant survival. But it also meant stepping into a world she did not understand. A coma patient. She whispered the word softly, tasting its weight. Hannah had never worked in a hospital before. She had cleaned homes, washed clothes, cooked meals. But caring for someone who lay between life and death felt different. He wouldn't speak, Wouldn't respond, wouldn't tell her if she was doing something wrong. Still, fear could not afford to win. At dawn, she rose, washed her face with cold water, and dressed carefully. Her clothes were simple but clean. She tied her scarf neatly, said a short prayer, and stepped outside. God, she murmured as she walked, I don't ask for comfort. Just give me strength. The Adebayo estate looked even more intimidating in the morning light. The gates opened slowly as if measuring her worth before allowing her in. The guards barely glanced at her this time, their eyes already trained to see her as part of the background. Inside the mansion was quiet, too quiet. Polished floors reflected sunlight. Expensive furniture sat untouched like it was waiting for people who no longer laughed. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else Hannah couldn't place grief, maybe. The house supervisor led her through wide corridors, giving instructions in a brisk tone. You'll be based mostly at the hospital, she said, but you'll clean here when needed. Don't disturb Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo unless spoken to, and stay out of the study. Yes, Hannah replied, nodding quickly. They stopped near a large window overlooking the garden. The patient is Mr. Robert Adebayo. The supervisor continued. He's been unconscious for 3 years. Doctors say... She paused, then waved her hand dismissively. Just do your job. Hannah swallowed. I understand. A driver was assigned to take her to St. Bridget Private Hospital. The ride was silent. Hannah watched the city pass by, unaware that every turn of the road was carrying her deeper into someone else's tragedy. At the hospital, the smell hit her first, clean, sharp, unforgiving. The supervisor handed her off to Nurse Abena Owusu, who glanced at Hannah with a mixture of fatigue and suspicion. This is the new help, Abena asked. Yes, the supervisor replied. She'll assist with daily care. Abena sighed. Fine. Follow me. They walked down a corridor Hannah would come to know intimately. Doors lined the walls, each hiding a story. Some held hope, others held endings. They stopped at one room. This is him, Abena said, pushing the door open. Hannah stepped inside and froze. Robert Adebayo lay on the bed, surrounded by machines that hummed softly like they were breathing for him. Tubes traced paths across his body. His face was calm, almost peaceful. But there was something unsettling about how still he was. He looked alive. Not like the living corpse Hannah had imagined. He was young, handsome in a quiet way. His skin carried warmth. His chest rose and fell rhythmically. For a brief moment, Hannah forgot to breathe. This is your responsibility now, Abena said bluntly. Cleaning him, turning him, feeding through the tube. Talking is unnecessary. He can't hear you. Hannah nodded, though something inside her resisted that last sentence. Doctors will come in and out. Abena continued. Don't touch the machines, don't make assumptions, and don't get attached. With that, she left. Hannah stood alone with Robert. The room felt heavy, like it was holding years of unshed tears. Slowly, she set down her bag and approached the bed. She reached out, then hesitated, unsure if touching him was allowed. It's okay, she whispered, not sure who she was reassuring, him or herself. She began her work carefully. She cleaned his face, her movements gentle. She adjusted the sheets, mindful of every tube. Her hands shook at first, then steadied. As she worked, she noticed small things, the faint scar near his hairline, the strength in his arms even unused, the way his brow creased slightly when the sun hit his face. He didn't look like someone ready to be forgotten. I'm Hannah, she said softly, surprising herself. I'll be here with you. The machines responded with their usual beeps. Still, she spoke, not because she expected an answer, but because silence felt wrong. Over the next few days, Hannah learned the rhythm of the room. Morning care, midday checks, quiet afternoons where the world seemed to pause. Nurses came and went, efficient but emotionally distant. Doctors spoke in measured tones, careful not to promise what they couldn't deliver. Hannah listened more than she spoke. She learned that Mr. Elijah Adebayo rarely came anymore, that Mrs. Margaret Adebayo never missed a day, that the staff had already decided Robert's story had ended. One afternoon, Margaret arrived while Hannah was adjusting the sheets. Margaret stopped at the door, watching silently. Hannah felt her presence and turned, startled. Good afternoon, Ma, she said quickly, stepping back. Margaret nodded, her eyes soft but tired. You must be the new girl. Yes, Ma. My name is Hannah. Margaret approached the bed and took Robert's hand. She didn't look at Hannah at first. Do you take good care of him? She asked quietly. Yes, Ma, Hannah replied, her voice sincere. I try my best. Margaret studied her for a moment as if weighing something unseen. Thank you, she said at last. Most people, they treat him like he's already gone. Hannah hesitated, then spoke before fear could stop her. He doesn't feel gone to me, Ma. Margaret's breath caught. She turned sharply. What do you mean? Hannah lowered her eyes. Suddenly worried she'd said too much. When I'm here, it feels like he's still listening. Maybe not with his ears, but somewhere. The room went very still. Margaret stared at her, tears pooling without warning. You're the first person to say that, she whispered. From that day, Margaret looked at Hannah differently, not as staff, but as someone who saw her son. Elijah Adebayo, however, was less impressed. When he learned that a new maid had been assigned to Robert, he frowned. Another one, he said to Victor. They come, they leave. What's the point? Victor shrugged. She seems quiet, desperate for work. Elijah scoffed. They always are. But he didn't intervene. Hannah continued her duties unnoticed by most, but not by Robert. Or at least, she didn't believe he was unaware. She spoke to him every day. She told him about her childhood, about losing her parents, about how hard it was to keep going when no one noticed your pain. You don't know me, she said one afternoon, wiping his hands, but I know what it feels like to be left behind. Sometimes when she talked, she thought she noticed changes, a subtle shift in his breathing, a slight tightening of his fingers. She told herself not to imagine things, but hope is stubborn, and quietly, without permission, without training, without expectation, Hannah Boateng began to believe that Robert Adebayo was still there, waiting. The days blended into one another inside room 317. Morning light crept through the narrow window, washing Robert Adebayo's face in pale gold. The machines hummed their steady rhythm, indifferent to hope or despair. Nurses came and went, efficient and distant. Doctors spoke in careful phrases that meant everything and nothing at once. And Hannah Boateng stayed. At first, she did exactly what she had been told. Clean, turn, adjust, feed through the tube. She followed instructions with the precision of someone who could not afford mistakes. Every movement was respectful, almost reverent, as if Robert could feel clumsiness even in silence. But silence, Hannah soon learned, was not empty. It carried weight. One morning, as she wiped Robert's arms, she noticed the way his skin warmed under her hands. Not cold, not lifeless, alive in its own quiet way. You know, she said softly, without thinking, people talk around you like you're not here. Her voice sounded strange in the still room. They say things they wouldn't say if you could answer. She paused, expecting to feel foolish. Instead, something inside her settled. So she continued. She talked while she worked. At first, it was small, harmless things, what she cooked the night before, how hot the weather was getting, how the bus conductor yelled at passengers for no reason. She told stories like she was filling time. Then the stories changed. She began to tell him about herself. I grew up in a one-room house, she said one afternoon, smoothing his blanket. My mother used to sing while she cooked. Even when she was tired, she sang. Hannah smiled faintly at the memory. She said singing reminded her that she was still alive. The machines beeped steadily. Another day, she said, I lost her 3 years ago. Same year you came here. Her throat tightened. She hadn't planned to say that. I used to sit by her bed just like this, Hannah whispered, and talk, even when she couldn't respond. She swallowed hard. Sometimes, talking was all I had. She stopped, then suddenly aware of how close she was to crying. She wiped her eyes quickly and returned to her duties, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. But from that day on, Hannah couldn't stop seeing the connection. She came earlier, stayed longer. Even when her shift ended, she lingered a few extra minutes sitting beside Robert's bed. Sometimes she read to him, old newspapers, psalms she remembered from childhood, short stories she found online. One evening, Nurse Abena Owusu caught her mid-sentence. What are you doing? Abena asked sharply from the doorway. Hannah startled. I was just reading. Abena frowned. Why? Hannah hesitated. I thought it might help. Abena shook her head, tired rather than angry. He's not aware. You'll only get attached. Hannah nodded. Yes, Ma. But when Abena left, Hannah continued reading quietly this time, because something told her stopping would feel like betrayal. As days passed, Hannah began noticing small things, very small things. One morning while she spoke about the rainstorm the night before, Robert's breathing changed slightly just for a moment. It deepened, then returned to normal. She froze. Her heart pounded. She watched the monitor, waiting for it to confirm what she felt. Nothing changed. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. "Just coincidence." But the next day, when she said his name, Robert, she thought his fingers twitched. Barely. So small, she almost dismissed it. She stood there holding her breath, afraid that looking too closely would make the moment disappear. "Did you hear me?" she whispered, leaning closer. "Nothing." Hannah straightened slowly, embarrassed by her own hope. She didn't tell anyone. She told herself it was stress, imagination, grief projecting onto silence. Still, she began paying closer attention. She noticed that when she spoke, his heart rate sometimes shifted, subtle, fleeting, but different. When she was quiet, it returned to its steady rhythm. She wanted to tell someone, but fear stopped her. She was just a maid, no medical training, no authority. Who would believe her? One afternoon, Margaret Adebayo arrived earlier than usual. She found Hannah sitting beside the bed, speaking softly. And even when things feel heavy, Hannah was saying, "You just keep breathing. That's what my mother told me." Margaret stood in the doorway, listening. She didn't interrupt. When Hannah noticed her and stood up quickly, Margaret waved her down. "No," she said gently. "Please, sit." Hannah obeyed, unsure. Margaret walked to the bed and placed her hand over Robert's. "You talk to him often," she observed. "Yes, Ma," Hannah said. "I hope that's not a problem." Margaret shook her head slowly. "I used to do the same." Her voice softened. "Everyone told me it was pointless, but I never believed that." She studied Hannah's face. "Do you really think he can hear you?" Hannah hesitated. Honesty trembled at the edge of her words. "I don't know how," she said carefully. "But I feel like something in him responds." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I feel that too," she whispered. But even doctors stopped believing after a while. They stood there together, two women bound by hope neither could prove. Later that evening, Elijah Adebayo came unexpectedly. He entered the room with his usual controlled posture, his presence filling the space. Hannah stepped back, immediately lowering her eyes. Elijah glanced at her briefly, then focused on the monitors. "Any change?" he asked Dr. Kwame Mensah, who stood nearby. Dr. Mensah shook his head. "No significant neurological improvement." Elijah nodded, jaw tight. As he turned to leave, he noticed Hannah watching Robert closely, her hand resting lightly on the bed rail. "What's your name?" Elijah asked suddenly. Hannah flinched. "Hannah, sir." Elijah studied her, measuring. "You're the one assigned here now." "Yes, sir." He hesitated, then said, "Make sure everything stays professional." "Yes, sir," Hannah replied quickly. Elijah left without another word. But something about his tone, less sharp than usual, stayed with her. That night, Hannah stayed late. The hospital was quieter than usual. Fewer footsteps, dimmed lights. She stood beside Robert, exhaustion heavy in her bones. "I don't know why I care so much," she admitted softly. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be given up on." She paused. "But I won't give up on you, not yet." As if in response, the monitor beeped slightly faster than steady. Hannah's breath caught. This time she couldn't ignore it. The next morning she mentioned it cautiously to Nurse Abena. "I think sometimes his heart rate changes when I speak," she said. Abena frowned. "That's not unusual. But it happens when I talk, not randomly." Abena sighed. "Hannah, please. We've seen families convince themselves of things that aren't there." Hannah nodded, feeling foolish. "I understand." Dr. Mensah overheard part of the conversation and approached. "What's this?" he asked. Hannah's heart raced. "Nothing, sir. Just observations." Dr. Mensah looked at her thoughtfully. "What kind of observations?" She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Small responses, changes in breathing, finger movement." Dr. Mensah studied her face, not dismissive but skeptical. "I appreciate your concern," he said, "but these can be reflexive responses." "Yes, sir," Hannah replied. He softened slightly. "Still, keep noting anything unusual." It wasn't encouragement, but it wasn't rejection either. That evening, Hannah returned to the room with renewed determination. She spoke to Robert like she always did, steadily, honestly. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she whispered a promise out loud. "I don't know how this ends," she said. "But as long as I'm here, you won't be alone." The machines hummed on. But somewhere beneath the silence, something stirred, and Hannah felt it. The first time Hannah truly believed something was different, she was afraid to admit it, even to herself. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the hospital felt half asleep. The night shift had ended. The day shift had not fully arrived. The corridor outside room 317 was almost silent. Hannah stood beside Robert's bed, checking his position the way she always did. She adjusted the pillow, careful not to disturb the tubes, then reached for a cloth to wipe his hands. As soon as her fingers touched his skin, she felt it, a squeeze, not strong, not deliberate, but real. Hannah froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. She didn't move her hand away. She didn't breathe. "Robert," she whispered. Her name for him slipped out without permission. The pressure was gone. His hand lay still again, relaxed in her palm like it always had. For a long moment, Hannah stood there trembling. It could have been a reflex, she told herself. Muscles can contract, nerves fire randomly. Everyone had told her this, but this didn't feel random. She slowly set his hand down and stepped back, pressing her fingers against her own lips, as if to keep from crying out. "Calm down," she murmured to herself. "You're imagining things." Still, the rest of her shift passed in a haze. Every sound made her jump. Every beep from the monitor sent her pulse racing. She watched Robert's face, searching for something, anything that would confirm what she'd felt. Nothing obvious happened, but Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that the room itself had shifted. That afternoon, she debated whether to tell someone. She walked past the nurse's station twice, opening her mouth, then closing it again. What would she even say? He squeezed my hand. They would laugh. Or worse, they would pity her. By evening, she decided to say nothing, but the next day it happened again. This time, Hannah was speaking. She had been telling Robert about a dream she'd had the night before, something silly about missing a bus and ending up at the ocean instead. "I don't even know how to swim," she said softly, smiling at the absurdity. But in the dream, I wasn't scared. As she spoke, she noticed the monitor. His heart rate had changed, not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable. She stopped talking. The rhythm slowed. She spoke again. It shifted. Hannah felt cold spread through her arms. This was no longer something she could ignore. That afternoon, she approached Nurse Abena Owusu again. Abena was busy filling out charts, her expression already tired. "Ma," Hannah said quietly, "please, can I ask you something?" Abena sighed without looking up. "Make it quick," Hannah swallowed. "I think Mr. Robert responds when I speak to him." Abena looked up sharply. "Responds how his heart rate changes, and yesterday I think he squeezed my hand." The silence that followed was heavy. Abena stared at Hannah for a long moment, then shook her head. "Hannah," she said slowly, "listen to me. Families see these things all the time. It doesn't mean what you think it means. I'm not his family," Hannah replied softly. "That's why I noticed." Abena closed her folder with a snap. "You're getting emotionally involved. That's dangerous in cases like this." "I know," Hannah said quickly, "but please, can you just check the monitor when I talk to him?" Abena hesitated. Then she sighed. "Fine. 5 minutes." They entered the room together. Abena stood by the machine's arms crossed. Hannah stood beside the bed, her hands shaking slightly. She took a breath. "Robert," she said gently. "It's Hannah." The monitor flickered. Abena frowned. Hannah continued. She spoke about the weather, about the hospital food, about how loud the generator had been that morning. The heart rate shifted again. Abena's posture changed, subtle, alert. She murmured. Then she waved her hand dismissively, still within reflexive parameters. "But you saw it," Hannah said, unable to hide the hope in her voice. Abena sighed. "I saw fluctuations, that's all." She turned to Hannah, her expression firm. "Do not build expectations. You'll only hurt yourself." That night, Hannah sat alone in the staff break room, staring at her hands. Maybe Abena was right. Maybe hope was a trap. But then she remembered the squeeze, the timing, the way it felt intentional. She couldn't forget it. 2 days later, Dr. Kwame Mensah made his routine rounds. Hannah waited until he finished examining Robert before speaking. "Doctor," she said quietly, "may I tell you something?" Dr. Mensah looked at her with mild curiosity. "Yes." She chose her words carefully. "I've noticed small changes. When I speak to him, his heart rate shifts. Once, he squeezed my hand." Dr. Mensah studied her face, not impatient, not amused, just thoughtful. "How long have you been observing this?" he asked. "About a week," Hannah replied. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. Dr. Mensah nodded slowly. You understand that coma patients can have involuntary responses? Yes, sir, Hannah said. But these feel consistent. Dr. Mensah looked at the monitor, then back at Robert's still face. Consistency is important, he said, but evidence matters more. Hannah's shoulders sank. So you don't believe me? Dr. Mensah raised a hand. I didn't say that. I'm saying we need caution. He sighed. If what you're seeing is real, it would be unusual, but not impossible. Hannah's heart leapt. We'll run additional monitoring, he continued. Nothing invasive, but don't read too much into small changes. Yes, sir, Hannah said, barely containing her relief. As Dr. Mensah left, she turned back to Robert, tears burning her eyes. They don't believe yet, she whispered. But I do. Days passed. The additional monitoring showed nothing dramatic, no awakening, no obvious neurological breakthrough, and the atmosphere shifted again, this time toward resignation. One afternoon, Hannah overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. Dr. Mensah and Elijah Adebayo stood in the corridor, voices low. We've reached a point where we need to discuss long-term decisions, Dr. Mensah said gently. Elijah's voice was tired. What kind of decisions? Life support, Dr. Mensah replied. Quality of life. There was a pause. How long, Elijah asked, would he survive without the machines? Dr. Mensah didn't answer immediately. Not long. Hannah's breath caught. She pressed herself against the wall, heart racing as they continued speaking. We've done everything, Dr. Mensah said. At some point we have to consider dignity. Elijah's voice dropped. Set a date. The words hit Hannah like a blow. She stumbled away before they could see her. Back in room 317, she collapsed into the chair beside Robert's bed. They're giving up, she whispered, tears spilling freely now. They're going to let you go. Her hands trembled as she took his. I don't know what to do, she said. I'm just a maid. No one listens to me. She bowed her head, shoulders shaking. Then she felt it again. A pressure, stronger this time. Hannah gasped and looked up. Robert's fingers were curled around hers, not tight, but unmistakably holding on. She stared at their joined hands, disbelief flooding her chest. No, she whispered. No, this isn't my imagination. She leaned closer, voice breaking. Robert, if you can hear me, please, don't let go. The monitor responded, heart rate rising, then steadying. Hannah laughed and cried at the same time. They think you're gone, she said through tears. But you're still here. I know it. In that moment, Hannah made a decision, a dangerous one. A decision that would put her job, her freedom, and her future at risk. She would not let them turn off the machines, not without a fight. The decision was made quietly, no announcement, no dramatic meeting, just a signature placed on a document behind closed doors. As if ending a life could be handled the same way, contracts were clean, efficient, final. Elijah Adebayo signed the consent form late that evening. His hand did not shake, but something inside him did. Dr. Kwame Mensah explained everything carefully, his voice steady but heavy with years of responsibility. We will give the family time, he said, a few days, so everyone can prepare. Elijah nodded, eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. How long, he asked. 72 hours, Dr. Mensah replied. Then we begin withdrawal of life support. 3 days. 3 days to say goodbye to a son who had not spoken in 3 years. When Margaret heard the news, she did not scream. She sat down slowly, as if her body had known this moment was coming long before her mind accepted it. No, she whispered. Please, not yet. Elijah stood beside her, stiff. Margaret, we've waited, we've hoped. We can't keep him trapped like this forever. Trapped, she cried suddenly, her voice breaking. You think he's trapped? Or you are? Elijah flinched. She stood up. Tears streaming freely now. You're tired, Elijah. I see it, but don't confuse your exhaustion with God's silence. He turned away. I can't do this anymore. Margaret stared at her husband, the man she had loved for decades, and for the first time she felt something dangerously close to anger. You're choosing to stop believing, she said quietly. Elijah didn't respond. That night Margaret went to the hospital alone. She sat beside Robert's bed, holding his hand, sobbing into the sheets. I'm sorry, she whispered over and over. I tried to be strong for you, The machines answered her with indifferent beeps, but she did not notice the subtle change in rhythm. She was too busy grieving. Hannah noticed. She stood frozen near the door, unseen, her heart pounding as she watched the monitor react to Margaret's voice. It was there again. That response. This time Hannah could no longer stay silent. The next morning she approached Elijah in the corridor. He was on his phone issuing instructions, his face drawn and hard. "Sir," Hannah said softly. Elijah turned, irritation already forming. "What is it?" She bowed her head respectfully. "Please, sir, I need to speak with you about Mr. Robert." Elijah sighed sharply. "Now is not the time." "I know my place," Hannah said quickly, her voice shaking. "But please, just 1 minute." Something in her tone made him pause. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't hysterical. She looked terrified but determined. "Speak," he said. Hannah swallowed hard. "Sir, I believe your son is responding." Elijah's expression darkened. "I've heard enough false hope." "I wouldn't say this if I wasn't sure," Hannah said, tears pooling. "When I speak to him, his heart rate changes. He squeezes my hand. Not randomly, not once, repeatedly." Silence fell between them. Elijah laughed once, a short, bitter sound. "You're a maid, Hannah, not a doctor." "I know," she replied, "but I'm the one who stays with him when everyone else leaves." That struck something. Elijah stepped closer. "Do you know how many people have told me things like this? Family members, nurses, even strangers with prayers and prophecies. I'm not asking you to believe in miracles," Hannah said. "I'm asking you to look." Elijah stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "This is over." He walked away. Hannah stood there shaking her chest tight with despair, but giving up was no longer an option. She returned to room 317 and closed the door softly. "They're planning to stop the machines," she whispered to Robert, tears slipping down her face. "They think it's mercy." She took his hand. "I don't know how to stop them," she said. "I don't have money. I don't have power." She laughed bitterly. "I don't even have a voice." The pressure came again, firm, clear. Hannah gasped. Robert's fingers tightened around hers just slightly but deliberately. Her breath hitched. "Robert," she whispered urgently, "if you can hear me, you have to help me. I can't do this alone." The monitor beeped faster. She looked up at his face. His eyelids fluttered, barely, but unmistakably. Hannah stumbled backward, her legs weak. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, you're still here." In that moment, Hannah made a terrifying realization. If she did nothing, Robert would die. If she did something, she might lose everything, her job, her freedom, possibly more. That evening, she overheard Nurse Abena speaking quietly with another nurse. "The family has decided," Abena said. "Withdrawal is scheduled." When the other nurse asked, "Friday morning. 2 days away." Hannah's mind raced. She didn't sleep that night. She sat beside Robert's bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, memorizing every detail of his face like she might never see it again. "I wish you could speak," she said softly. "I wish you could tell them yourself." She leaned closer. "But if you can't, I'll speak for you." The next morning she approached Dr. Mensah. "Doctor," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning inside her. "Please, can you delay the withdrawal?" Dr. Mensah looked at her with weary compassion. "Hannah, this decision isn't mine, but you've seen it," she insisted. "The changes. I've seen fluctuations." He replied gently. "Not enough. Then let me show you," she said desperately. He hesitated. "Hannah, please," she whispered. "Just watch." They stood by the bed. Hannah took Robert's hand. "Robert," she said clearly, her voice trembling, "if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." Nothing happened. Her heart dropped. She swallowed and tried again. "Please." Seconds passed. Dr. Mensah shifted uncomfortably. Then a movement, subtle but visible. Robert's fingers curled. Dr. Mensah stiffened. Again, Hannah spoke. "Squeeze my hand." The pressure returned. This time Dr. Mensah saw it clearly. He inhaled sharply. "That's unusual," he murmured. "Unusual isn't impossible," Hannah said, tears streaming now. "Please, don't let them stop yet." Dr. Mensah straightened slowly, his expression serious. "I will speak to Elijah," he said. "No promises." It wasn't much, but it was something. As Dr. Mensah left the room, Hannah sank into the chair beside Robert, exhausted and shaking. "They might still do it," she whispered. "But at least now, someone else has seen you." She squeezed his hand gently. "I won't leave," she promised. "Not now. Not ever. And somewhere beneath the machines, beneath the silence, Robert Adebayo held on by the thinnest thread of life and the unwavering courage of a woman no one thought mattered. Friday arrived faster than Hannah had feared. The hospital woke that morning with the same routines: cleaners mopping floors, nurses exchanging reports, doctors moving from room to room. But for Hannah, every sound felt sharper, heavier, like the world was counting down. 2 days. Dr. Kwame Mensah had spoken to Elijah Adebayo the night before. Hannah knew that much. She had seen the doctor enter Elijah's private hospital office, his posture unusually tense. What she didn't know was the outcome. No one told her anything. That silence was its own answer. Hannah stood in room 317 watching Robert sleep beneath the machines, her hands clasped so tightly they ached. "I don't know what they decided," she whispered, "but I'm still here." She reached for his hand. This time the squeeze came almost immediately. Not strong, but certain. Her throat tightened. "I wish you could see what you're doing to me," she said with a shaky smile. "You're making me brave when I don't know how to be." Outside the room, voices echoed down the corridor. Elijah Adebayo walked toward room 317 with slow, deliberate steps. Dr. Mensah walked beside him, a folder tucked under his arm. Elijah had not slept. His face looked older somehow, drawn heavy like grief had finally decided to leave its mark. All night, Hannah's words had replayed in his head. "He squeezes my hand. His heart rate changes when I speak." He had dismissed them, tried to bury them under logic, but then Dr. Mensah had said something that Elijah could not ignore. "I saw movement," the doctor had admitted quietly, not enough to call it consciousness, but enough to make me uncomfortable with certainty. Uncomfortable with certainty. Elijah hated uncertainty. It was the one thing money could not conquer. As they reached the door, Elijah paused. "Doctor," he said quietly, "if this were your son, what would you do?" Dr. Mensah hesitated. "I would ask for more time." Elijah closed his eyes briefly. "Then why haven't you stopped it?" he asked. "Because I don't make the final decision," Dr. Mensah replied gently. "You do?" Elijah opened his eyes. "Give me until tomorrow," he said. Dr. Mensah nodded. "I can delay 1 day, no more." Elijah exhaled slowly. 1 day. When Elijah entered the room, Hannah stiffened immediately. She stepped back, lowering her eyes, her heart racing. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. Elijah nodded without looking at her. His attention was fixed on his son. Robert looked the same as always, still, silent, yet something felt different now that Elijah knew what to look for. "How long have you been working here?" Elijah asked suddenly. Hannah startled. 3 weeks, sir, and in those 3 weeks, he said slowly, "You believe my son has responded to you?" "Yes, sir," Hannah replied, her voice trembling but firm. Elijah turned to face her fully. "You understand what you're claiming," he said. "You understand what it would mean if you're wrong." "I do," Hannah said, "and I wouldn't say it if I wasn't sure." Elijah studied her. She was thin, nervous, clearly afraid of him, but she was not lying. That realization unsettled him more than he expected. "Show me," he said. Hannah's breath caught. "Now." Her hand shook as she stepped forward. She took Robert's hand gently. "Robert," she said softly, her voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Your father is here." The monitor flickered. Elijah leaned closer. Hannah swallowed and continued. "If you can hear me, squeeze my hand." Nothing happened. The room stretched painfully. Elijah's jaw tightened. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "Please," she whispered, "just once more." Seconds passed. Then Robert's fingers moved. Not much, but enough. Elijah froze. His breath hitched sharply. "Hannah," Elijah said hoarsely, "do it again." Hannah nodded, tears streaming freely now. "Robert," she said, barely able to speak. "Squeeze my hand. Again." The pressure returned. Elijah staggered backward, grabbing the chair to steady himself. "No," he whispered. "No, this can't be." Dr. Mensah, standing just inside the doorway, stared at the monitor, then at Robert's hand. "That is not random," he said quietly. Elijah's chest heaved. For the first time in 3 years, something inside him shattered completely. He sank into the chair beside the bed and grabbed his son's arm, holding on like he might disappear again. "My boy," he whispered, "you're still here." Hannah stepped back, giving him space, her heart pounding with relief and fear. Elijah turned toward her slowly. "You," he said, his voice thick. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I tried," Hannah replied softly. "You didn't believe me." Elijah closed his eyes, shame washing over his face. "I didn't want to hope," he admitted. "Hope hurts." Hannah nodded. "So does giving up." The words hung between them. That afternoon, Margaret arrived. She found Elijah sitting beside Robert's bed holding his hand. She stopped short, startled. "Elijah," she said, "what's going on?" Elijah looked up at her, eyes red. He responded. He said simply, "He's been responding." Margaret rushed forward. What Hannah explained, everything quietly, carefully, tears slipping down her cheeks as she spoke. Margaret listened, hands trembling. Then she took Robert's other hand. "My son," she whispered, "if you can hear me, please." Robert's breathing changed. Margaret gasped. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing openly. "He knows," she cried. "He knows we're here." That evening, Elijah called an emergency meeting. Doctors, specialists, administrators. He stood at the head of the room, his voice steady but fierce. "We are not withdrawing life support," he said. "Not now, not tomorrow, not until every possibility is exhausted." Some doctors objected gently. Elijah silenced them. "I will take full responsibility," he said, "whatever it costs." Dr. Mensah met Hannah's eyes briefly from across the room. This was only the beginning. Later that night, Hannah sat alone in room 317 again. Robert's hand rested loosely in hers. "You did it," she whispered. "You fought back." She smiled through her tears. "I knew you would." The machines hummed on, but now the silence felt different, not empty, waiting. After Elijah Adebayo canceled the withdrawal, the hospital atmosphere shifted subtly at first, then unmistakably. Room 317 was no longer treated like a dead end. Nurses lingered longer. Doctors asked more questions. New specialists were brought in to review scans that had already been reviewed 100 times. The beeping machines sounded the same, but the people listening to them had changed. Hope had returned, and hope, Hannah learned, could be as dangerous as despair. For Hannah Boateng, the victory didn't feel like celebration. It felt like standing in the middle of a road after stopping a speeding truck, relieved you survived but shaken by how close death had been. Elijah was suddenly everywhere. He visited twice a day now, sometimes 3 times. He sat in the chair beside Robert's bed like a man trying to make up for lost years in a single week. He spoke to his son awkwardly at first, as if the words didn't fit in his mouth. It's your father," he would say, clearing his throat. "I'm here." Sometimes he said nothing at all. He just held Robert's hand, staring at the slow rise and fall of his chest, eyes glistening when he thought no one was watching. Margaret, on the other hand, was openly emotional. She cried without shame. She prayed aloud. She sang hymns softly beside the bed, her voice trembling but steady. "My child," she whispered, brushing Robert's forehead, "we're not leaving you. Not now." Hannah watched them quietly, her heart heavy in ways she couldn't explain. She was glad, but she was also afraid. Because now that the rich and powerful were paying attention again, questions began to circle her like vultures. It started with Nurse Abena Owusu. Abena had never been cruel, but she was skeptical by nature, and in a hospital, skepticism was survival. One afternoon, she pulled Hannah aside near the supply room. "I've been watching you," Abena said, arms crossed. Hannah's stomach tightened. Ma Abena lowered her voice. "How exactly did you get him to respond?" Hannah blinked. "I didn't get him to do anything. I just talked to him." Abena's eyes narrowed. "Talked?" "Yes." Abena leaned closer. "No herbs, no strange methods, no rituals." Hannah recoiled slightly, hurt flashing across her face. "No," she said firmly. "I didn't do anything like that." Abena studied her, then sighed. "You know people will talk, right?" Hannah's throat tightened. "Let them talk." Abena's voice softened just a little. "Careful, Hannah. In places like this, when something good happens, people start looking for someone to blame." The warning lodged in Hannah's chest like a stone. That evening, as Hannah walked down the corridor, she heard whispers. "That maid, she did something. How did he respond after 3 years?" She kept her head down, pretending not to hear. But the whispers followed her. Even worse, Victor Danjuma was paying attention now. Victor visited the hospital the day after Elijah's public refusal to withdraw life support. He arrived in a tailored suit, calm as ever, but his eyes were sharper than usual. He greeted Dr. Mensah politely, then approached Hannah where she stood near the door of room 317. "So you're Hannah Boateng," he said smoothly. Hannah's spine stiffened. "Yes, sir." Victor smiled, pleasant but not warm. "You've become important." Hannah didn't know what to say. Victor tilted his head. "Tell me, Hannah, what exactly happened that day?" Hannah's stomach tightened. "I was doing my duties, sir. I spoke to Mr. Robert," he responded. Victor's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened, and before you arrived, he said softly, "He never responded." Hannah hesitated. "I don't know, sir. I wasn't here before." Victor nodded slowly, like a man storing information. "You must understand," he said, "people will be curious. They may think you're manipulating the family." Hannah swallowed hard. "I would never." Victor leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Curiosity can turn into suspicion. Suspicion can become trouble." Hannah's hands trembled. "Why are you saying this to me?" Victor straightened, returning to polite distance. "I'm advising you, that's all." Then he walked away. Hannah stood frozen, her heart pounding. Something about Victor's presence felt wrong, not loud and obvious, but like a shadow that refused to leave. Later, Dr. Mensah ran additional tests, MRI updates, neurological reflex checks, stimulation protocols. Everything was done carefully scientifically. The results were confusing. Not enough for a miracle headline, but enough to prove one thing: Robert's brain activity was no longer flat in the ways it had been. Dr. Mensah spoke to Elijah in private. "He's not awake," Dr. Mensah said, "but he's responding." "That matters." Elijah's jaw tightened. "So what do? We begin a structured program," Dr. Mensah replied. "Stimulus therapy, physical therapy, consistent verbal engagement." Elijah nodded. "Do it." Then he added, "And Hannah stays." Dr. Mensah hesitated. "Elijah, hospital protocols." Elijah cut him off. "My son," responded to her voice. "That's not coincidence." Margaret agreed immediately. "She understands him," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. "She spoke to him when nobody else did." Hannah didn't know whether to feel honored or terrified, because staying meant more exposure, more eyes, more blame if anything went wrong. That night, Hannah returned to room 317 after her shift ended. She sat beside Robert, exhausted, the hospital dim and quiet around her. "Everyone's looking at me now," she whispered. "I didn't ask for this." She paused, swallowing back tears. "I just didn't want you to die." She held his hand gently. "Do you know what it feels like to be seen only when something happens? Like you're invisible until you become useful." The monitor beeped steadily. Hannah leaned closer, voice trembling. "If you wake up, they'll call it a miracle. They'll thank God. They'll thank doctors. They'll thank money." She let out a shaky laugh. "No one will remember the maid who just sat here and talked." Her eyes filled. "But that's okay," she whispered, "because I didn't do it for praise, a faint pressure." Robert's fingers curled. Hannah froze, then smiled through tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's enough." But as she sat there unaware, Victor Danjuma stood down the corridor, half hidden behind a corner, watching through the glass panel of the door. His face was unreadable, and in his pocket his phone screen glowed briefly, an outgoing message drafted but not yet sent. Because in Victor's mind, Robert Adebayo waking up was not hope. It was a threat. The night everything changed began quietly, too quietly. St. Bridget Private Hospital had settled into its late-hour rhythm, dimmed corridor lights, hushed footsteps, distant beeps echoing like heartbeats in the dark. Room 317 felt suspended outside time, the air thick with anticipation no one had named aloud. Hannah Boateng stood alone beside Robert Adebayo's bed. Her shift had officially ended an hour ago, but she hadn't left. No one asked her to. No one stopped her either, since the canceled withdrawal rules had blurred bent under the weight of Elijah Adebayo's authority and the fragile hope clinging to the room. Hannah stared at Robert's face, memorizing it again. Tonight felt different. She couldn't explain why, but something in her chest refused to stay calm. It wasn't fear exactly. It was urgency. "Like the moment just before a storm breaks. They're watching you more closely now," she whispered, glancing briefly at the door. "Doctors, nurses, your father." She exhaled slowly. "But I still hear the same silence." She took his hand. "Robert," she said softly. "It's Hannah." The monitor responded immediately, heart rate lifting then settling, her breath caught. She leaned closer. You've been fighting so hard. I know you're tired." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "But if you can hear me, I need you to do something tonight." The words surprised even her. She hadn't planned them. She hadn't planned what came next either. Hannah looked at the machines, the ventilator breathing force, the monitor tracking his heart, the IV lines keeping his body stable. She had been warned never to touch them, never interfere, never act outside protocol. But protocol had already decided to let him die. Her hands trembled as she brushed her thumb over his knuckles. "I'm going to talk to you," she whispered. "Not like before. I'm going to talk to the part of you that's still awake." She took a deep breath and began. "Robert Adebayo," she said clearly, firmly. "Your father is here every day now. He sits beside you even when he doesn't know what to say." The monitor flickered. "Your mother sings to you." Hannah continued, voice shaking. "She cries, but she doesn't leave." Another shift. Hannah's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. "They almost gave up," she whispered. "But they didn't. Because you didn't." She squeezed his hand gently. "If you can hear me, don't just hold on." She leaned in close, her forehead nearly touching his. "Come back." The word echoed in the quiet room. Nothing happened. For a terrifying second, doubt rushed in. Then, the monitor alarmed. Not loudly, not frantically, but enough. Hannah froze, eyes snapping to the screen. His heart rate spiked sharply, then dropped, then surged again. "Robert," she whispered urgently, "stay with me." She reached instinctively for his shoulder, and then she saw it. His chest. It wasn't following the ventilator's rhythm anymore. It was fighting it. "No." She breathed. "No, no." The ventilator beeped, signaling resistance. Hannah's training screamed at her to step back. Her instinct screamed louder. She remembered Dr. Mensah's words from days earlier, spoken during a therapy briefing she'd been allowed to observe. If the patient attempts spontaneous breathing, the machine will register conflict. Spontaneous breathing. Hannah's mind raced. If Robert was trying to breathe on his own, the machine might suppress it. Her hands shook violently. "This is insane," she whispered to herself. If she touched the machine, she could be fired, arrested, worse, if she didn't. She looked at Robert's face. His brow was furrowed now, not peaceful, straining. "Robert," she said urgently, tears streaming down her face, "if you're trying to breathe, do it now." The monitor alarmed again, louder this time. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Hannah didn't think anymore. She acted. She reached for the ventilator settings, not to turn it off, but to reduce assistance just enough, just for a moment. Her fingers hovered. "God forgive me," she whispered. Then she adjusted the dial. The machine protested. Robert's chest rose, uneven, shallow, but on its own. Hannah sobbed. That's it. Breathe." The door flew open. "What are you doing?" Nurse Abena shouted, rushing in. The alarm blared now, sharp and urgent. Dr. Mensah followed seconds later, eyes widening at the scene. "Step away from the machine," he ordered. Hannah backed away instantly, hands raised, shaking violently. "I'm sorry," she cried. "He was trying to breathe. I saw it. I felt it." Security rushed in. Another nurse. Chaos exploded into the room. Dr. Mensah rushed to Robert's side, checking monitors, calling out instructions. "Prepare emergency support." Now Elijah Adebayo appeared at the doorway, his face draining of color. "What happened?" he demanded. Dr. Mensah didn't answer immediately. He was watching Robert, because Robert's chest was still moving, weakly, but independently. "He's initiating breaths," Dr. Mensah said slowly, disbelief threading his voice. "This shouldn't be happening." Elijah staggered forward. What Margaret pushed past him, crying out, "My son." Robert's breathing faltered. "Assist," Dr. Mensah ordered. The team stabilized him quickly, carefully, increasing support, monitoring vitals, restoring balance. The alarms gradually quieted. The room fell into stunned silence. Everyone stared at the monitors, at Robert, at Hannah standing near the wall, shaking like she might collapse. Dr. Mensah turned slowly toward her. "You," he said, "what exactly did you do?" Hannah swallowed hard, tears blurring her vision. "I lowered the ventilator assistance, just a little." He was fighting it. Abena gasped. "Do you know how dangerous that was?" "Yes," Hannah whispered. But letting him die was worse. Elijah stared at Hannah like he was seeing her for the first time. "You touched the machine," he said quietly. "I did," Hannah replied. "And if you punish me for it, I understand." Dr. Mensah looked back at Robert, then at the data streaming across the monitor. Her timing was precise, he said slowly. If she hadn't adjusted when she did, we might have missed this window. The room held its breath. You're saying, Elijah began. Dr. Mensah nodded. He attempted spontaneous breathing. That is not reflex. That is neurological intent. Margaret sobbed openly, now gripping Elijah's arm. He's coming back, she cried. He's coming back. Elijah's knees buckled. He sank into the chair, staring at his son like the world had just cracked open. Then he looked at Hannah. She expected anger, punishment. Instead, she saw awe. You risked everything, Elijah said hoarsely, for my son. Hannah wiped her face with shaking hands. I didn't think about consequences. Dr. Mensah exhaled slowly. We need to move him to intensive neurological observation immediately. The team sprang into action. As Robert was prepared for transfer, Elijah stepped toward Hannah. You saved him, he said simply. Hannah shook her head. He saved himself. I just listened. Elijah reached out, then hesitated, unsure how to speak to someone who had just changed his life. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, you won't face it alone. Hannah nodded, exhausted, tears slipping free. As they wheeled Robert out of room 317, his fingers twitched again. And for the first time since the accident, his eyelids fluttered. Just once. Just enough. Robert Adebayo did not wake up that night, but the hospital no longer treated him like a man who never would. He was moved to a specialized neurological unit before dawn, surrounded by doctors who spoke faster. Now their voices charged with a cautious excitement they tried hard to suppress. Charts were updated, orders rewritten, new machines rolled in, replacing the old ones like symbols of a future that had quietly returned. Hannah watched from the corner as they worked on him. Her hands still shook. What she had done replayed over and over in her mind the moment her fingers touched the ventilator, the sound of the alarm, the looks of shock. She knew how close she had come to disaster. She also knew that if she had not acted, Robert might have lost his only chance. Still, fear wrapped tightly around her chest. She waited for security, for dismissal, for handcuffs. None came. Instead, Dr. Kwame Mensah approached her an hour later, his face unreadable. Hannah, he said, gesturing for her to step aside. Her stomach dropped. Yes, sir, she replied quietly. They walked a short distance down the corridor. Dr. Mensah stopped near a window where early morning light filtered in. What you did last night, he began slowly, was a violation of protocol. Hannah nodded. I know. In another situation, he continued, you would be removed from this hospital immediately. She lowered her head. I understand. There was a long pause. But this situation, Dr. Mensah said, is not another situation. Hannah looked up, startled. Dr. Mensah exhaled. Your intervention coincided with the first confirmed attempt at spontaneous breathing in 3 years. That cannot be ignored. Tears burned Hannah's eyes. So, am I in trouble? Dr. Mensah studied her carefully. You're under review, but for now, you stay. Relief hit her so hard her knees almost gave way. Thank you, she whispered. Dr. Mensah nodded once. Be aware, though, this will bring scrutiny. Not everyone will be grateful. She knew exactly who he meant. Victor Danjuma arrived mid-morning. He walked into the neurological unit with his usual composed confidence, but his eyes flicked quickly from monitor to monitor, taking in the changes. When he saw Hannah standing near Robert's bed, his lips tightened almost imperceptibly. So Victor said smoothly, the maid becomes a hero. Hannah stiffened. I'm not a hero, sir, Victor smiled thinly. Of course not. You're just fortunate. Elijah stood nearby listening. Victor turned to him. This is quite the situation, Elijah. The board is already asking questions. Media interest may follow. Elijah's expression hardened. My son nearly breathed on his own last night. Yes, Victor said calmly. And if something goes wrong next time, Hannah felt heat rise in her chest. Victor continued, hospitals operate on procedure for a reason. Emotional decisions can be dangerous. Elijah turned sharply. Are you saying Hannah endangered my son? Victor raised his hands placatingly. I'm saying reliance on untrained staff sets a risky precedent. Silence fell. Elijah stepped closer to Victor, his voice low. What sets a risky precedent is giving up on your own family. Victor blinked clearly, not expecting that. I trust the doctor? Elijah continued, "and I trust what I saw." Victor inclined his head, masking irritation. "As you wish." But as he walked away, his jaw tightened. Margaret arrived soon after, her face drawn but hopeful. She took Hannah's hands in hers without hesitation. "You stayed," Margaret said, voice trembling, "when everyone else would have walked away." Hannah swallowed. "I couldn't leave him." Margaret nodded. "Neither could I. I just didn't know how to fight anymore." They stood together in quiet understanding. By afternoon, the news had spread through the hospital. Whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into theories. Some called Hannah brave. Some called her reckless. Others muttered darker things about luck, about coincidence, about a poor girl interfering in matters beyond her place. Hannah heard it all. She pretended not to. Late that evening, Dr. Mensah gathered Elijah and Margaret privately. "There's something you should know," he said carefully. "Robert's neurological responses suggest he may be transitioning from deep coma to a minimally conscious state." Margaret gasped. It means Dr. Mensah said that he may become aware intermittently, not awake, but aware." Elijah's breath hitched. "Can he hear us?" "Possibly," Dr. Mensah replied. Voices, familiar ones. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He's been listening this whole time." Elijah closed his eyes, guilt flooding his face. All those days he hadn't come, all those nights he'd chosen work over sitting by his son. Hannah stood quietly by the door, heart pounding. "Dr. Tao." Mensah turned to her. Hannah continued speaking to him, but under observation. She nodded. "Yes, sir." That night, Hannah sat beside Robert again. The room felt different, lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. "I don't know what you can hear," she whispered, "but everyone's here now." She paused. "Your father looks scared," she added gently, "but in a good way, like he doesn't want to lose you again." She smiled faintly. "Your mother never stopped believing." Robert's fingers twitched. Hannah's breath caught. "You're doing so well," she whispered. "Just keep holding on." As she sat there, Elijah watched from the doorway. For the first time, he didn't see a maid. He saw a woman who had done what he could not, who had stayed when hope was inconvenient, who had listened when silence was easier. And something inside him shifted. Later that night, Elijah called Victor to his office. "We need to talk." Elijah said, his tone cold. Victor sat composed. "About Hannah, yes," Elijah replied. "She stays. She is protected." Victor's eyes hardened. Protected from what? Elijah leaned forward. From suspicion, from pressure, from anyone who thinks they can intimidate her. Victor's smile was tight. "You're letting emotion cloud judgment," Elijah's voice dropped. "You're letting fear cloud yours." The tension between them stretched thin. Victor stood. "I hope your faith is rewarded." "So do I," Elijah replied. "Because if it is, some truths may come out." Victor paused briefly at the door, then left without another word. Back in the neurological unit, Hannah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The danger wasn't gone, but for the first time she wasn't alone in it. She squeezed Robert's hand gently. "We've crossed something," she whispered. "There's no turning back now." And beneath the machines, beneath the murmurs of cautious hope, Robert Adebayo stayed balanced between worlds, guided by a voice that had refused to let him fade. Robert Adebayo opened his eyes on a Monday morning. Not fully, not suddenly, but enough. It happened just after sunrise, when the neurological unit was quieter than usual and the world outside the window was still pale with early light. Hannah was seated beside his bed, reading softly from a folded piece of paper, one of Margaret's favorite psalms. Her voice was steady, low, familiar. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." She paused, sensing something before she saw it. The room felt different. Hannah lifted her eyes to Robert's face, and her breath caught. His eyelids were moving, slowly, unevenly, like muscles remembering a forgotten task. "Robert," she whispered, barely daring to breathe. His eyelids fluttered again. Then just for a second they opened. Not wide, not focused, but open. Hannah froze, her heart slamming so hard she thought she might collapse. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, God." She stood up so suddenly, her chair scraped loudly across the floor. "Doctor," she called, her voice breaking. "Doctor, please." Nurse Abena Owusu rushed in first. "What is it?" she demanded, then followed Hannah's gaze. Abena gasped. Robert's eyes were half open now, unfocused, but undeniably awake. "Call Dr. Mensah," Abena said sharply, already moving. "Now!" The room filled with motion. Dr. Kwame Mensah arrived within seconds, flanked by 2 nurses. He leaned over Robert, his professional calm cracking just enough to reveal shock. "Robert," he said clearly, "can you hear me?" Robert's gaze drifted slightly. His breathing quickened. "Yes," Dr. Mensah murmured. "Yet." That's awareness. Margaret arrived moments later, having been summoned by a frantic call. She stopped in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. "My son," she whispered. Hannah turned toward her, tears streaming down her face. He opened his eyes. Margaret rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside the bed, clutching Robert's hand. "My baby," she sobbed. "I'm here. Mama is here." Robert's lips parted. No sound came out, but his brow furrowed, his face tightening with effort. Dr. Mensah leaned closer. "Don't push," he said gently. "Just rest." Elijah arrived last. He stood in the doorway, frozen. For 3 years he had imagined this moment in his worst nightmares and his most desperate prayers. Now that it was real, his body refused to move. "Hannah," Margaret cried softly. "Tell him his father is here." Hannah swallowed and leaned closer to Robert. "Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "your father is here. Elijah is here." Something changed. Robert's eyes shifted. Slowly, painfully, his gaze moved toward the doorway. Elijah's breath left him in a broken sound. "He sees me," he whispered. "He sees me." Elijah stepped forward, his knees weak, and took his son's hand. "My boy," he said hoarsely, "I'm here. I'm so sorry I left you alone." Robert's fingers twitched, then miraculously they curled around his father's hand. Elijah collapsed into the chair, sobbing openly, now pressing Robert's hand to his forehead, like a man who had just been forgiven by life itself. "I'm here," he repeated. "I'm here. I won't leave again." The room held its breath. Dr. Mensah straightened slowly, awe and caution battling in his expression. "This is a breakthrough," he said quietly. "But we must be careful. He's not fully conscious yet. Recovery will be slow." Margaret nodded through tears. "Slow is fine. Alive is enough." Throughout it all, Hannah stood back, shaking, overwhelmed. She hadn't expected this. Not so soon. Not like this. Dr. Mensah turned to her. "Hannah, come closer." She stepped forward hesitantly. "Robert," Dr. Mensah said gently, "this is Hannah. You've heard her voice before." Robert's gaze shifted again. This time it settled on her, and stayed. Hannah felt her chest tighten. "Hi," she whispered, voice barely there. "You did it." Robert's lips moved. A sound escaped, not a word, but something close enough that Hannah's knees buckled. Dr. Mensah nodded slowly. "He's recognizing voices, faces." Margaret wiped her tears. "He knows her," she said. "He always did." But not everyone in the hospital shared the same joy. By afternoon, the news had reached Victor Danjuma. He arrived at the neurological unit with a carefully neutral expression, but his eyes betrayed tension. "So it's true," he said quietly to Elijah. He opened his eyes. "Yes," Elijah replied coldly, and he responded. Victor nodded. "That changes things. It changes everything," Elijah corrected. Victor glanced toward Hannah, who stood near the window. "Especially her," he said. Elijah followed his gaze. "You will treat Hannah with respect," Elijah said firmly. "She is under my protection." Victor smiled faintly. "Of course, I meant no offense." But when Victor left the room, his phone was already in his hand. Because if Robert was waking up, then memories might follow. And if memories returned, some secrets would not survive. That evening, Hannah stayed late again. Robert slept most of the time, now exhausted by the effort of simply being aware. But his presence filled the room in a way it never had before. He was no longer silent. He was resting. Hannah sat beside him, holding his hand gently. "You scared everyone," she whispered with a soft laugh. But in a good way. She hesitated, then added, "You know, they're calling it a miracle." She smiled sadly. "But miracles don't happen alone. You fought too." Robert's fingers tightened slightly. She leaned closer. "And whatever comes next, I'll be here. If you want me to be." His breathing changed, calmer, steadier. Outside the room, Elijah watched through the glass. For the first time in years, he felt something other than fear or control. He felt gratitude, not just for his son's life, but for the woman who had believed when belief was inconvenient, powerless, and dangerous. And somewhere deep within Robert Adebayo's returning consciousness, one truth was already forming, clearer than pain, clearer than memory. He was not alone. Robert's awakening did not arrive with clarity. It came in fragments, flashes of light, voices drifting in and out, pain that moved like a tide, sometimes distant, sometimes crashing too close. Some days Robert knew where he was. Other days he didn't know who he was. Dr. Kwame Mensah explained it carefully to the family. "This stage is unpredictable," he said. "Memory may return slowly, or in pieces. We must be patient." Elijah nodded. Though patience had never been his strength, Margaret, on the other hand, embraced the waiting like prayer. Hannah stayed, always. She learned the rhythm of Robert's good hours and bad ones. She learned when to speak and when silence helped more. She learned that his eyes responded best to calm voices and that loud emotions overwhelmed him. When Robert was confused, Hannah grounded him. "You're safe," she would say gently. "You're in the hospital. You've been sick, but you're waking up." Sometimes he stared at her lost. Sometimes he squeezed her hand. And sometimes, without warning, his face would tighten, his breathing sharp, his eyes darkening with fear. It was during one of those moments that the memories began to break through. Robert woke suddenly one afternoon gasping. His heart rate spiked. Monitors beeped sharply. Hannah rushed to his side. "It's okay. You're okay." But Robert wasn't hearing her. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "No. Stop." Dr. Mensah hurried in. "Robert, look at me," he said calmly. "You're here. You're not there anymore." Robert's eyes darted wildly. "Car," he rasped. "The car." Elijah froze. Margaret clutched her chest. Dr. Mensah signaled for calm. "Robert, you're remembering something. That's normal. Tell us what you see." Robert's breathing slowed slightly. "It was dark," he said weakly. "I was driving. Someone called my name." Hannah leaned closer, her voice steady. "You're safe now. Just talk." Robert swallowed hard. A voice, familiar. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Victor," Robert whispered. The room went still. Elijah felt the air leave his lungs. "Victor," he repeated. "Victor Danjuma." Robert's eyes fluttered. He was there, before the crash. Dr. Mensah exchanged a sharp glance with Elijah. "What do you mean?" Robert the doctor asked. Robert squeezed Hannah's hand tightly, grounding himself. "He told me to stop the car." Robert said slowly. "Said there was something urgent. Said you needed me." Elijah's face hardened. "He said to pull over." Robert continued. "But I didn't. I told him I'd call him back." Robert's brow furrowed deeply. Then another car swerved, too fast, like it was aiming. Margaret gasped softly. Elijah stood up abruptly. "Victor told you to stop." Robert nodded faintly. He sounded angry, different. Dr. Mensah raised a hand. "Robert, don't push yourself." "But the dam had cracked. That wasn't an accident," Robert whispered. "I remember headlights, too close." Silence pressed heavily on the room. Elijah's mind raced. Victor had been with him for over 10 years. Trusted, loyal, always nearby, too nearby. Elijah turned slowly toward the door. "Call security," he said quietly. Margaret stared at him. "Elijah, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Elijah replied coldly, "that my son didn't lose 3 years of his life by chance." Word spread quickly, too quickly. By the time Victor Danjuma arrived at the hospital that evening, tension had already taken root. Victor entered Robert's room with his usual polite smile, but it faltered when he saw Elijah standing stiffly by the window, arms crossed. Victor said smoothly, "I heard you were awake." Robert's eyes shifted to him and narrowed. Fear flickered across Robert's face, sharp and unmistakable. Hannah felt his grip tighten around her hand. Victor noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked lightly. "You look upset." Robert swallowed. "You were there." Victor chuckled. "I visit you all the time, Robert." "No," Robert said, voice trembling. Before the crash." Victor's smile froze. Elijah stepped forward. "You told him to stop the car." Victor laughed a little too loudly. "This is confusion, trauma. You know how memory can distort?" "I heard your voice," Robert said. "You said my father needed me." Elijah's voice dropped dangerously low. "Did he?" Victor's eyes darted briefly to the door. "Elijah," he said carefully, "this is not the time for accusations." "Then this is the perfect time," Elijah snapped. Because my son is finally speaking. Security stepped closer. Victor's composure cracked just for a second. Robert, Victor said, forcing calm. You were confused. You were injured. No, Robert whispered. I was afraid. That was enough. Elijah turned sharply. Get him out! Victor stepped back. You can't do this without proof. Elijah's eyes burned. Then you won't mind an investigation. 2 days later, the truth began to unravel. Traffic camera footage once dismissed was reviewed again, this time with pressure. Phone records were subpoenaed. Messages surfaced. Calls made minutes before the crash. And then money. Transfers routed through shell accounts. Payments to a driver with a history of reckless driving. Payments made from an account Victor controlled. The pieces clicked together with brutal clarity. Victor Danjuma had believed Robert was a threat. Robert had questioned company practices, had asked about missing funds, had mentioned audits. Victor hadn't expected a coma. He had expected silence. Elijah sat alone in his office when the final report arrived. He stared at the evidence until his vision blurred. He had trusted the wrong man and almost buried his son because of it. Victor was arrested quietly, no spectacle, no press conference. But when the news reached the hospital, Robert wept, not out of relief, out of grief. He betrayed us, Robert whispered to Hannah. I trusted him. Hannah squeezed his hand. You survived him. Elijah entered the room later that night. He stood at Robert's bedside, unable to meet his eyes. I failed you, he said hoarsely. As a father, as a man, Robert looked at him weakly. You believed the wrong person. So did I, Elijah whispered. Margaret joined them, her hands on both their shoulders. Blame won't heal us, she said gently. But truth will. That night, Hannah sat with Robert long after everyone else had left. You were brave, she whispered, even when you didn't know it. Robert looked at her, his gaze clearer now. You stayed, he said faintly, when I couldn't ask you to. Hannah smiled through tears. I wasn't leaving. And for the first time since he opened his eyes, Robert Adebayo slept peacefully. Because the past had finally spoken, and the future, though uncertain, was no longer poisoned by lies. Victor Danjuma's arrest didn't feel like victory inside the Adebayo family. It felt like someone had torn open an old wound and poured truth into it, cleansing necessary but burning all the same. Elijah Adebayo moved through the days like a man carrying a stone in his chest. He attended police meetings, signed statements, spoke to lawyers, and secured every detail with the same precision he once used for business deals. But every time he returned to the hospital, all his power meant nothing. Because Robert was still fragile. He was awake more often now, yes. He could focus longer. He could squeeze hands, blink in response to questions, even whisper short words when his throat allowed it. But recovery was slow, painful, humbling. Dr. Kwame Mensah explained it plainly. The brain is healing. But healing is not a straight road. Some days he will progress. Some days he will fall back. That's normal. Elijah listened, but his guilt didn't. He watched Robert struggle to lift a finger and felt the weight of every day he had almost ended his son's life out of exhaustion. Margaret remained the steady flame. She sat beside Robert, feeding him small spoonfuls when he could swallow, wiping his face, praying with the same devotion she'd carried for 3 years. But now her prayers sounded different. They were no longer desperate. They were grateful. Hannah Boateng stayed at the center of it all, quietly holding the family together in ways no one expected. She spoke to Robert during therapy sessions, encouraging him when his frustration rose. You're not failing, she'd say softly. You're fighting. Sometimes Robert's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from the humiliation of needing help to do what once was effortless. One afternoon during a physical therapy session, Robert tried to sit up on his own. His muscles trembled violently. His face tightened with strain. I can, he whispered hoarsely. I can. His body gave out. He fell back onto the bed, breath shaking. Hannah immediately reached for his hand. Robert turned his face away, ashamed. I used to run, he rasped. I used to drive. I used to. Hannah squeezed his hand firmly. And now you're learning again. That doesn't make you less. It makes you alive. Robert's eyes shut tight as a tear slipped down his cheek. Margaret wiped it away. My son, she whispered. Your life is not your strength. Your life is your heart. Those words stayed with him. And they stayed with Elijah too. Because Elijah was changing, not suddenly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. He stopped shouting at nurses. He stopped treating doctors like servants. He started asking questions, real ones, about Robert's comfort, his fears, his emotions. One evening, Elijah asked Dr. Mensah to speak privately. "I want to do something," Elijah said. Dr. Mensah raised an eyebrow. "For Robert?" "For Hannah," Elijah replied. Dr. Mensah's expression softened with understanding. "What do you mean?" Elijah's voice roughened. "She saved my son, and she's still here working like she's invisible." Dr. Mensah nodded. "Hannah has shown extraordinary courage." Elijah looked down briefly. "I want to change her life. Properly." When Elijah told Margaret his plan, she nodded immediately. "She deserves more than gratitude," Margaret said firmly. "She deserves dignity." The next day, Elijah called Hannah into the hospital office. Hannah walked in nervously, wiping her hands on her skirt as if she wasn't sure whether she belonged in that room. "Elijah, sir," she said softly, lowering her head. "You called me?" Elijah gestured to the chair. "Sit, Hannah." She sat slowly, cautious. Elijah leaned forward slightly. "I owe you a debt." Hannah shook her head quickly. "No, sir, you don't. I was just doing my job." Elijah's eyes narrowed gently. "No, you were doing more than a job." He paused, then continued. "You spoke to my son when we had stopped speaking. You fought for him when we were tired. You risked your future for his life." Hannah's eyes filled. "I didn't think. I just couldn't let him go." Elijah nodded once. "Exactly." He slid a folder across the desk. In that folder, he said, "is a new contract. You will no longer be a maid." Hannah stared confused. "Sir, you will be hired as a paid caregiver and personal assistant to Robert during his recovery," Elijah said. "With benefits, with proper salary, with training." Hannah's mouth parted in shock. Elijah continued, "And you will move into a safe apartment paid for by my family, not a servant's room, your own home." Hannah's hands trembled. "Sir, Elijah raised a hand. "This is not charity. This is responsibility. You earned it." Tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Elijah replied. Hannah nodded, sobbing quietly. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Margaret, standing by the door, wiped her eyes. "And one more thing," Elijah added, his voice softer now. "If you want to continue your education, we will support it." Hannah froze. "Education?" Elijah nodded. "I asked about your background. You left school early." Hannah swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I had to work." Elijah's expression tightened with regret. "You shouldn't have had to choose survival over your future." Hannah lowered her head, overwhelmed. When she returned to Robert's room, he was awake. His eyes followed her as she entered, noticing her red, swollen eyes. "What happened?" he whispered. Hannah sat beside him, smiling through tears. "Your father, he changed my job. He's helping me." Robert's gaze softened. He squeezed her hand weakly. "Good," he whispered. "You deserve it." Hannah swallowed hard. "I don't know how to handle all this." Robert's voice was faint but clear. "You handled death. You can handle blessings." Hannah laughed softly through tears. Outside the room, Elijah watched them. For the first time, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Not wealth, not control, not power. Healing. Not just Robert's body, but the family's spirit. That night, Elijah gathered his senior staff at his company headquarters and made a statement that shocked them. "Victor Danjuma's role is terminated permanently," he said coldly. "Any contracts signed under his authority will be reviewed, and anyone connected to his schemes will be removed." The room went silent. Elijah's voice hardened further. "No more corruption in my name. No more using my family's grief as a shield." Some men shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided his gaze. Elijah didn't care, because for the first time, the strongest thing in him wasn't pride. It was purpose. Back at the hospital, Hannah sat beside Robert, holding his hand while he slept. She whispered softly, not even sure if he heard. "Thank you," she said, "for fighting your way back." And somewhere in his sleep, Robert's fingers tightened slightly like a promise. The storm had not ended, but the sky was clearing. Recovery did not arrive like a miracle montage. It arrived like work. Every morning, Robert Adebayo woke to the same routine: physiotherapy that burned his muscles, speech exercises that left his throat aching, neurological tests that reminded him how much control he had lost over his own body. Some days he was strong. Other days the weight of it all crushed him. On the hardest mornings, he would stare at the ceiling in silence, anger tightening his jaw. "I hate this," he whispered once, his voice hoarse with effort. "I hate needing help to breathe, to sit, to exist." Hannah sat beside him, tying the strap of his therapy brace gently. "I know," she said softly, "but needing help doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're still here." He closed his eyes, fighting the shame. "I used to be someone," he said. "Now I'm just a patient." Hannah paused, then met his eyes. "You were someone because of who you were," she said, "not because of what you could do. That hasn't changed." Those words stayed with him longer than any medicine. Weeks passed. Robert learned to sit up on his own, then to stand with help, then to take a few trembling steps between parallel bars, his entire body shaking with effort. Margaret cried every time he succeeded, no matter how small the victory. Elijah watched in silence, his hands clenched, his eyes wet more often than he would ever admit. And Hannah was always there, not hovering, not controlling, just present. One afternoon during a quiet therapy break, Robert looked at her thoughtfully. "You know," he said slowly, "when I was gone, your voice was always there." Hannah froze slightly. "You remember that?" He nodded faintly. "Not clearly, but I remember feeling anchored, like something was holding me here." He swallowed. "That was you." Hannah looked away, emotion tightening her chest. "I was just talking." "No," Robert said gently. "You were choosing me, every day." The words settled between them, heavy, honest, unromantic, and deeply meaningful. As Robert's condition stabilized, discussions about the future began. Doctors recommended a long-term rehabilitation facility abroad, specialists, advanced therapy programs. Elijah could afford all of it, but Robert surprised everyone. "I don't want to leave yet," he said one evening, his voice stronger now. "Not until I can walk on my own, not until I finish this here." Margaret looked concerned. "But the best care I know," Robert said, "but I need to rebuild my life where I almost lost it." He glanced at Hannah. "And I don't want to forget who stayed." Elijah watched his son carefully. "What do you want, Robert?" he asked quietly. Robert thought for a long moment. "I want to live differently," he said. Slower, more honestly. Elijah exhaled, something loosening inside him. "Then that's what you'll do," he said. One evening, Elijah invited Hannah to the family home, not as staff, as a guest. Hannah arrived nervous, wearing a simple dress, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she sat in the spacious living room. Elijah joined her, pouring tea himself. "Hannah," he said, "I need to say something properly." She lowered her head. "Sir?" "No titles," he said gently. "Not tonight." He sat opposite her. "For years," Elijah continued, "I believed control was love, providing money, solving problems, making decisions." He paused. "I was wrong." Hannah listened quietly. "You taught me something," Elijah said. "Without power, without status, just by staying." Hannah's eyes filled. "I didn't plan any of this. That's why it matters," Elijah replied. He placed an envelope on the table. Hannah stiffened. "Sir, I don't want more money." Elijah raised a hand. "It's not money." Inside the envelope was an admission letter, a nursing and rehabilitation sciences program, full scholarship. Hannah stared at it, her hands trembling. I can't," she whispered. "I never finished secondary school." Elijah smiled slightly. "You will. We'll arrange everything. Classes, tutors, support." Tears streamed down Hannah's face. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because Elijah said you already do the work of someone trained. Education will only give you protection and choice." Hannah pressed the paper to her chest, sobbing quietly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't even have words." Elijah nodded. "You don't need them." Months later, Robert took his first unaided steps across the hospital courtyard. Slow, careful, determined. Margaret clapped through tears. Elijah stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest. Hannah walked beside Robert but didn't hold him. "You've got this," she said quietly. Robert took another step, then another. When he reached the bench at the far end, he laughed, a sound rusty with disuse, but real. "I'm walking," he said in disbelief. Hannah laughed too, covering her mouth. "Yes," she said, "you are." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Robert sat beside Hannah on the bench. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when I wake up fully, I don't know what life looks like yet, Hannah nodded. Me neither. He turned to her serious. But I know one thing, he said. I don't want a life built on power anymore. I want one built on presence. She met his gaze. Whatever that looks like, he added, I want to walk it, honestly. Hannah didn't answer right away. She didn't need to, because this story was never about romance. It was about restoration. About a man who lost everything and found his way back. About a woman the world overlooked until her kindness became undeniable. And about the truth that no wealth can buy. That sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that keeps a soul alive. This story reminds us of a truth we often forget in a world obsessed with power, money, and status. Kindness does not announce itself, it does not wear titles, and it is rarely recognized when it first appears. Hannah had no authority, no education, no influence. She had only compassion and the courage to stay when staying was inconvenient, risky, and unrewarded. And that was enough to change a destiny. Robert survived not because of machines alone, but because someone believed his life still mattered when the world had quietly moved on. Elijah learned that control is not love, and that providing comfort is not the same as providing presence. Life will test us in moments when walking away is easier than staying. And in those moments, our choices, small, unseen, uncelebrated, carry more power than we realize. So the question is this. If you were standing where Hannah stood, would you stay if this story moved you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what this story reminded you of. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel because sometimes hope needs a voice.